Alright, hi everybody, my name is Sean, and this YouTube channel is going to teach you everything I know about professional retouching. This is my first video, so please bear with me if I stumble a little bit or go a little slow. I'm sure I'm going to get better with time, but we'll just see what happens. So before we get started with getting into a little bit about retouching, I think the first thing we need to do is teach you a little bit about Photoshop and where everything is. I'm working in Photoshop CS6. You can be working in an earlier version, or the latest version is Photoshop CC. Really, they are all going to work just about the same for our purposes. So once you open up Photoshop, you're going to see a couple things. I think my Photoshop is set up pretty much how the default is. Let me arrange workspace. Yeah, I'm on the default, so everything should look pretty much like this when you open it up. If it doesn't, a couple things that might be different is most of the time it's set up like this. I don't like to work like this because it's kind of hard to get to the edges of your photograph. So what I always do is I hit F, and F is going to make it really easy to move around your photograph really quickly. The first thing you're going to see, and the thing that you're going to use the most, is the toolbar over here on the left side of the screen. If your toolbar looks different than this, you can probably just double tap it, and this will just change whether it's in 2 columns or whether it's in 1 column. I like it in 1 column just because I'm used to working that way, but really you could do whatever you want. So that's going to be the thing that you access probably the most. The other thing is going to be on the right side, and it's going to be the layers panel over here. Photoshop arranges everything in layers, which is really just stacking things on top of other things. And below that is going to be the info panel, and that's going to display all the different information about what's going on in your photograph. We'll go over to that in a second. And then next to the layers panel is the channels panel, which we'll also go over in a second, but I just want you to be aware of everything and where it is. These are probably going to be the 4 things that you use the most. Also, the right here, this little 3 square with the arrow next to it, is the history panel. This is also going to be your best friend because it allows you to go back in time and it logs everything. So before you get started in Photoshop, what I would recommend doing is going over to here and opening up your preferences. And we're going to toggle down through interface, through file handling, through performance, and you're going to make sure you have a lot of history states. I think by default it is much lower than that. You want to up this as much as possible so that if you make a mistake, you can go back in time and not mess anything up. The next thing you're going to want to do before you really get started with any retouching is check the settings for whatever image you have open. The easiest way to do that is to go over here to Image and go down to Mode and just review what the settings currently are. I'll be doing mostly things in RGB color and in 16-bit. Okay, so I guess the first thing we should get into is the histogram. The histogram is going to be a window histogram right here. And I've got my histogram set to an expanded view, which is going to give me this extra information here. If you don't have it, you probably are going to have it set on the compact view by default, which is just going to look like that. But if you want to see the expanded view, you can just hit the little arrow right here and toggle down to expanded view. The reason why I like to use the expanded view is you can change the channel output from all channels to showing colors, and that's going to show you a better image of what your actual histogram looks like. So what is the histogram and how does it work? The histogram is a graphic view of all the different colors in your image. I chose a fairly simple image for this tutorial just because it's a little easier to read the histogram, and it's the first thing I could find. When you're looking at the histogram, all the way on the left here are going to be your darkest tones, all the way on the right here are going to be your lightest tones, and then right here in the middle is a perfect middle gray. You can see just by looking at the image, this is a pretty high key light image, so most of the color sits over on this end. The higher the graph goes, the more pixels are dedicated to that particular value. So we've got a lot of pixels that are this pretty high gray here, so it's going to peak in this area right here. We've got just a few colors that are really dark, like these shadows right here, and the text, and so there's really just a very small line that happens right down here. You can isolate a single channel to see how they're different by viewing a single channel here. And what a channel is just a one view of a single color and how those look in the histogram view. So you can actually see that this does have a lot of blue in it and there isn't really any red in it. So if you look between the blue channel and the red channel, there is a little bit less red in it than blue. But also it's a pretty neutral channel, so the histogram doesn't wildly jump around in its shape. If there was a lot of red in one area and a lot of blue in another area, it might look very different. So just be aware the histogram is there and you can check on it that way. The other big way that you're going to be able to check on your image is by hovering. Anytime you hover over a pixel, you're going to get some information down in the info panel down there, and it's going to tell you the value of that particular pixel that you're hovering over at that moment. So like right now, you can see my RGB values are 204, 207, and 212. And then next to it, it's also going to give you CMYK values as a percentage. If we move over to the blue area, you can see we have a lot more in the blue channel than in the red channel. And if we move down here, we can see that it's gotten darker, but it still has about the same proportion of red to blue. These are really good numbers to watch out for, especially if you want to watch out for where they start to get too high, and we'll explain that in just a moment. The other thing you want to look at with color space is whether you're working in or out of gamut. So as you're retouching, you need to be mindful of the fact that you might be printing this in the future. And if you ever are going to print it in the future, you need to know that sometimes what you print out isn't what you see on the page. And that's because printers work in a different color space than computers do. Computers work in RGB, like we said before, and printers work in CMYK for the most part. CMYK is kind of the opposite of RGB color, and they look very different. If you want to see a graphic representation of what RGB versus CMYK looks like, you can go down to the color sync utility. Oops, sorry. You can also access that in the utility panels here by going Applications, Utilities, and Color Sync is right there, or access it by Apple spacebar and just type Color Sync Utility into the spotlight and bring it up. So if you look at the different profiles, this is going to show everything that's on the system. If we look at Adobe RGB here, you can kind of scroll around and see all the different colors that are available. So you can see there's actually a lot of blue and a lot of green available, but not as much red. And that's just what RGB color looks like. If you look at sRGB color, this is what web browsers and iPhones and really any phone is going to see as sRGB color. This has much smaller space to account for. So I like to think of this as a box of crayons, And depending on what color space you're working in, you may have a smaller or a larger box of crayons. CMYK also has a much smaller box of crayons to work with. So why this matters is sometimes you're going to be working with colors that are going to exist in RGB but not exist in CMYK or not exist in sRGB. And what that means when you're using a color that isn't in another profile, particularly in CMYK, that means that you're out of gamut. Out of gamut. Out of gamut is usually really bad. If you are out of gamut and then you try to convert your image to that new color space without correcting the gamut first, Photoshop is going to try and do it for you, and it doesn't always do a really good job of it. So we can check that by going over to View, Proof Colors. If you do Proof Colors, it's going to do an estimation of what it looks like when you switch over to a different profile. You can change your proof setup to tell you which profile you're going to be checking against. I have it set to check against CMYK because the place where I'm going to be checking this most often is going to be for printing, but you can also check against sRGB, like if you're converting for the web. And then if you turn on proof colors, it's going to show you what it looks like when you convert colors. So as you can see, this actually loses a lot of punch in the blues when I convert. If we go to CMYK, CMYK does have more colors than sRGB, so it does look a little bit better. But you're still going to have to contend with those color shifts and color differences. So it's something to be aware of. I'm going to turn proof colors off because I don't want to see that. I want to see the actual pixels right now. If we zoom in to this particular image and then check one of these colors that I knew was already out of gamut, you'll see here in the color editor that there's this little caution sign. That is a preemptive, you are out of gamut, this does not exist in CMYK color warning. So that's another quick way to check it. See, now this deeper color is in gamut, but this pale turquoise sky blue kind of color is definitely not in gamut. So it's something you want to definitely be aware of. All these grays are probably going to be in gamut just fine. So there's that. So how do you avoid being out of gamut, and how do you avoid making sure that you have as many colors as possible? You want to make sure that you're working in a good bit depth. Bit depth is, like I said over here, 8 versus 16 bit depth. Bit depth is really how many different colors are available to you for each color channel, and it's actually totally mathematical. All pixels, which just for the sake of a visual reference, we're going to go down to View, Pixel Grid. We can see that each pixel is really just a square of color. And each square of color is made up of 3 different channels, red, green, and blue. Each of those channels has 256 colors available to it, except when you're working in 16-bit or a lower bit depth or higher bit depth. We just use 256 colors because it's the most common. If you're working with JPEGs, something is automatically going to come in 8-bit. And if you're working in RAW files or in TIFF files, you have the option of working in 8 or 16-bit images. So how is bit depth actually calculated? Each bit in your bit depth has 2 states, and that's on or off. And that on or off is represented by two values, a 0 for off or a 1 for on. And that's going to exist for each bit in the bit depth. So a 1-bit image has 2 possible colors, black and white. A 2-bit image has 4 possible colors. A 4-bit image has 16 possible colors, so on and so forth. So the easiest way to calculate it is the number of colors that are available to you is 2 to the power of how many bits you're working in. So 8-bit image is calculated by doing 2 to the 8th power, or 256. That is why when you're working in editing photographs, there are 255 possible colors for each channel. It's 0 through 255. So that means each 8-bit image is going to have, let's do a little quick math here. Oops, sorry, that keeps popping up. 256 times 256 times 256, 256 to the third power, 16,770,216 possible colors in a 8-bit image. Now, bear in mind, the human eye actually only sees 10 million different colors, 10 to 12 million different colors, depending on what source you're looking at. So you can't actually even see all the different colors that are available in an 8-bit image, but your computer can. And in a 16-bit image, it's going to actually have something like 281 trillion different color combinations available to you. So you may be wondering yourself, why does this actually matter? Well, in retouching, there are two major things that really happen in retouching. You're either replacing pixels with new pixels, or you're moving pixels around to become different values. So what can happen is, when you're pushing those pixels around, like if I wanted to push this area, I'll explain some of this stuff in a little bit, but if I wanted to push this pixel around, at some point, like right around here, you're going to start to see something ugly happening. And that's because we've pushed this too far. This is something that you really want to be aware of, is that you can actually push pixels way too far in Photoshop. And the reason why that's usually happening is one channel is getting way pushed in way too far of a direction than it really wants to go. And one of the ways you can really be aware of this is to check the info panel and make sure that your channels are within a reasonable range. Where this is really going to become a big problem a lot of the times is when you're working with gradients, which is what this image has in it, is a really big gradient that goes from 244 at the brightest, there in the blue channel, 245, out to 156 here in the corner. And that can cause something called banding. Banding happens when you don't have enough colors to choose from in your image. And so when it's creating this gradient, Photoshop is going to sort of make up mathematically how to bridge that gap between the colors that it has and the colors that it doesn't have. The way that you can check for something like this happening is doing what's called a solar curve here. I'm going to delete this and redo it actually. You can create a solar curve to check for banding by going down here. We're going to create an adjustment layer, and we're going to go down to curves. Now this is actually just going to create sort of a filter that we can stick on top of our image to check against things. So I'm going to grab down here near the black part of this histogram, and I'm going to pull it all the way up, almost out of the frame to the whites. Then I'm going to go over a little bit and pull all the way down, almost to the blacks. Then I'm going to go all the way up to the whites, and all the way down to the blacks again. There we go. When you do this, you really just want to make sure you don't like go all the way over the edge, or it'll do weird things like that and try and delete it. And we can see all the problem spots in this image. There is a little bit of banding happening across the image. Some of this is actually from the sensor on the camera. See these bands that are happening right here? That can actually be from the sensor. This is actually from the composite of this image. So is this, so is that, so is that, so is that. And we can fix some of that by a variety of different ways. I'll go over that in a different video, but this is going to get rid, you can check for banding, and I will show you in a different video how you can get rid of banding by a couple different methods. This is another, that was actually just from the zoom. You want to make sure you're zoomed into actual pixels, and it'll show you when you're banding or when you're not banding. See, like, this looks like really bad banding, but it's really just because we're zoomed out and Photoshop's having to render a quick preview for us, and it's not doing a very good job of it. If we zoom in to actual pixels, we can see that's not actually really happening. And you can just name this solar curve and use that to periodically check your image to make sure that you're not pushing things too far. So that's about it for this episode. We've learned what color space is, what bit depth is, and how it's calculated, and why you should often work in 16-bit to make sure that you have the most colors available to you. Once again, always working in 16-bit whenever you have a chance to. But when do you not really need to work in 16-bit? You don't always have to work in 16-bit, and truth be told, it really does increase your file size quite a bit. I think this file is quite large. Let's see if we can see what it is. 93 megs for a single file, and that's almost completely flat. Actually, the unflattened version of this file is over 2 gigs. So, when do you not need to actually do any of this? When you're working on a really simple image, when you don't have something that's got a crazy gradient across it, when you don't have to do a lot of retouching, when you don't have to push things around a lot, it's not really necessary to work in 16-bit. If you do have a lot of colors, if you have colors that reach the end of the spectrum like we talked about in the color sync utility, if you're working at something at the very edge, like a lot of really chromatic blues or really chromatic greens, it might be a good idea for you to have 16-bit turned on. And it's also a good thing to really be working 16-bit from the get-go. Switching from 8-bit to 16-bit to 8-bit and back and forth can cause problems for you. So that's about it for this episode. We learned about what color space is, how to set it up when you start Photoshop to make sure that you're working in the right color space and the right bit depth. We learned what bit depth is and how it's calculated, and why you should be working in 16-bit most of the time. If you have any questions about anything that you saw or any suggestions for future episodes, please let me know. And if you liked what you saw, please go ahead and hit the subscribe button. I'm going to be making videos on a regular basis about retouching, and in the next video we're going to go into sort of the basics of retouching and cleaning up an image. And we'll start with this image actually, so we can see where this image started and everything that I did to make this image look great.